But over time, we then are able to build a map to say these are the roles and functions in the supply chain that move commodities. And then we create a separate map, usually going the other way. When I say map, I sort of mean like a diagram, it's often laid out in a combination of like Microsoft Excel and PowerPoint, just because those are programs that lots of people have. We've used network analysis programs as well. But I mean, I can do it with Post-its and string on a wall if I need to. It's just to sort of show the progression and to explain how stuff moves from one place to another, and how money moves how money oils that system. What we found in a number of places, I did a project a few years ago in Gabon in Central Africa, which was really interesting, looking at the ivory trade. And I was working with the Gabonese government and their national parks and the anti-poaching unit within their national park system. And we spent months mapping out the poaching gangs, I guess you'd call them, the criminal groups that were poaching elephants. And then on top of that, we mapped out the networks that were exporting ivory. And they were also, in many cases, exporting rosewood and other endangered timber. And what we realized is that the Gabonese commander and I, what we realized was that he and his guys were going out into, kind of remote jungly areas that were dangerous, if nothing else, because there's, yellow fever and Ebola and et cetera, but also, armed poachers, and that within days they would be arrested. And so then we set off on a project to map the corrupt networks that existed on top of the criminal supply chain. That meant that because what was happening was that every time they'd go out and launch an operation to arrest somebody, within 3 or 4 days, they'd be released on some technicality. And so we were later able to map out all the judges and more senior officials that were on the take in the country. It was a really fascinating project. And I spoke to him, I think it was about 6 months ago, and asked him if how it was going. And he said, it's still very difficult. And I said, well, what's your biggest problem? Is it crime or corruption? And he said, without a doubt, it's the corruption. So that's become, in many ways, for me, more of a focus than the criminals themselves. If you have a government that's clean, that's functioning effectively, criminals don't really have much room to operate. Corruption really is the grease that keeps the machine going.
So you talked about the importance of having local friends and working with local researchers. And I think oftentimes in academic circles, when they talk about conflict resolution, it's told from a very kind of high-level analytical perspective and often misses out on the perspective of local voices and local communities. So can you share some experiences that you've had with local communities that you've worked in, whether in Afghanistan or anywhere else you've conducted field work, that perhaps challenged what you thought you knew about the conflict and, or made you think about the conflict differently?
Yeah, totally. I mean, first of all, I am alive and in one piece today because of my local colleagues in multiple different countries. The number of times I have been physically rescued or pulled out of a situation when it started to turn, I could maybe count on two hands the numbers of times that's happened, but I certainly would not be alive today if it weren't for my local friends who were and colleagues who in many cases were taking far greater risks than I was to go out in these communities and ask these questions. I think one of the things that was hardest for me to understand at first was the extent to which you can have battlefield enemies in a place like Afghanistan, but we also saw this in the Balkans, that were literally killing each other by day, and yet at night would be collaborating to traffic drugs, or something else. And so that was something that took me a long time to get my head around. And yet I've learned that it's incredibly common in conflict that enemies will still get along when they need to, when there's opportunity for money to be made. They will find a way to reach a solution. And I think it's an important lesson for us in terms of peace building approaches, that you have to understand the political economy of conflict, and you have to help, if you can help opposing sides reach a solution that is economically acceptable to them, where both sides are going to make money and they're not, or both sides are going to see themselves getting some kind of financial slice of the pie at the end, where their communities and their backers will be supported financially and will be able to survive. It can provide you a pathway towards some sort of conflict resolution.
Actually, on that's a great segue into my next question, which is about how to deal with the conflict elite. So, in Afghanistan, with respect to the Afghanistan war, right now there are peace talks going on in Doha that are attempting to resolve this dispute and pave the way for U.S. withdrawal. Now, the chances of that actually happening, many people would say are low. But from your perspective, in terms of incorporating what we know about the political economy of conflict, why is it important to think about a peace dividend for the conflict elite when sometimes it seems like there's more pressing and more important issues?
Well, it's a really good question, and I'm also impressed when anybody else uses terms like conflict elite, because it's something that I obsess over, and that I think not a lot of people think about or even identify. But it's certainly a case in Afghanistan that was a country that many of the power brokers, many of the conflict elite are precisely that. They became powerful as a result of the conflict, and their families or their tribes were not powerful before. And so they will potentially see themselves as losing influence, losing income at the end of the conflict. So I think one of the most important things to do, whether you're trying to investigate, say, our messed up healthcare system in this country, or why a conflict is continuing in a place like Mozambique or Afghanistan, and it just nothing seems to solve it. For me, the first order of business is to figure out who's benefiting from it continuing to happen, who's making money off of the conflict and the perpetuation of the conflict. And if you can get those people who are benefiting from it to agree for it to end, then I think you're on the road to recovery. Even if you can just figure out who they are that's benefiting from it, you're halfway to a solution. But in Afghanistan, I think we're seeing now, with the explosion of violence that's happening, and in particular in Helmand province, which is the number one province for producing poppy in Afghanistan, that there's forces at work that don't want this peace deal to go through. They're not complying with the ceasefire, and so I don't have a lot of optimism about where this is going. But I also don't think that a peace deal. There's going to have to be some kind of settlement with the Taliban, but I don't think a settlement that involves bringing the Taliban into the government is a good idea. I think that I think that the international community should be negotiating with Afghanistan's moderates, of which there are many, instead of their violent drug trafficking extremists, of which there are few. So I think it's unfortunate the decisions that have been made around the Doha Accord.
In closing, I want to ask a broader question about how you see the causal relationship between the kinds of illegal financial flows that we're talking about and violence and disorder. That is, after all, the theme of this podcast. So do you think it's more the case that criminal networks are simply exploiting weakened institutions that have brought about civil conflict and violence, or do their activities actually precipitate a breakdown into violence and disorder, or is it?
I think it's. I think the issue you're talking about goes in both directions. I think that the illicit financial flows can both be part of what's literally like an asymmetric warfare campaign for insurgent and violent groups. They can help to finance attacks. They can help to finance corruption. They can have a very corrosive impact. Plus the strength of insurgent or criminal gangs perpetuates or pushes the belief among the community that the government is weak and ineffectual. So I think that illicit flows can have very damaging impact on a variety of levels. The other issue is that, and there's a group here in DC called Global Financial Integrity that does a lot of really good work tracking this issue. But illicit financial outflows from a lot of countries in the developing world, in particular, they've done some really great work in Africa, are often 7 to 10 times higher than aid and development inflows and foreign direct investment. And so, at the same time that there are efforts to try and stabilize unstable countries, the outflow of cash is really just sucking the place dry, sucking its bone marrow out.
Well, Gretchen, you've been very generous with your time. Thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thank you, Aishwarya. Thank you, Mwangi.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Root of Conflict featuring Gretchen Peters. Special thanks to UC3P and the Pearson Institute for their continued support of this series. For more information on the Pearson Institute's research and events, visit thepearsoninstitute.org and follow them on Twitter.